And we are live. Every time we do this and Steph is not here, I start to get that feeling where it's like when you go home from the hospital with a newborn baby and you cannot believe that people are letting you do this. Uh,
Yeah,
so it
or
is,
do it multiple times. That's
yeah,
the other thing.
exactly. Well, actually, Bryce, I'm curious because this is the second time I've done this without Steph. But you've got multiple daughters, and did you have that same feeling when you left the hospital each time, or did it feel like did it feel natural after that?
Not at all. It never feels natural. There feels something wrong that somebody's entrusting us with, these little babies and, being in Houston and you're driving down the highway and you see all the cars on the road and instantly you're realizing that nobody's padded in mattresses and, it's, and it's just how quick can you get home at that point?
Yeah, exactly. Well, let's get going then. I mean, now that we are live, I'll just kind of kick things off and say to everyone, welcome to the Keys to AWS Optimization. This is the show where we share stories, concepts, and solutions to unlock your spend at AWS. My name is John Massey. I'm a principal optimization architect with our strategic accounts here at AWS. And today we are very fortunate to have Bryce Dickens joining us. And I'll pass it over to you, Bryce, to do a quick intro.
Hey, folks, really appreciate you letting us talk to you here for a little bit. I'm a principal financial architect here with AWS, and best way to think about it is John and I have the same job. We just service different customers, and I know John will certainly speak to his background a little bit, but at least for us, it's been an absolute joy being here with AWS doing what we do. But I always wasn't doing what I do today. So we're going to be talking a lot about our backgrounds and what we had from a security perspective. I used to work for a big oil and gas company and held a myriad of different security roles in my tenure there. Some of it was doing application security testing. Some of it was doing patching of SAP systems and even doing some security in the cloud as well across multiple cloud platforms. So it's basically with that scope, John and I were talking, we're like, you know, we've got to do a show about security because so many times in John and I's private conversations, like when we're helping with customers, we were just like, there's so much overlap between what the security taught us and what we're helping our customers with here with cloud financial management.
Yeah, and that's exactly what we're going to talk about today. So we want to talk about some of the lessons that we've learned from IT security and how those apply to cloud FinOps. And I think even it goes, a little bit beyond, just IT security. Some of the stuff we've talked about in the past has been around, promoting that culture change. Where are spots where folks can kind of look inward to look at where they've achieved culture change in the past that has kind of involved, this like horizontal layer that's touched everything that they're doing, maybe with their IT infrastructure, how developers are operating. And IT security has been one of those places where more strongly enforced, more outcome dependent than we might see with other transformational places, other, kind of culture change areas. But that's specifically why we wanted to hone in on, those lessons from the security world. I think one other piece kind of before we jump into it too, is that we're seeing more folks like look at this from like a cost governance perspective. They want to put those governance controls in, and sometimes those mechanisms already exist today. Maybe there's an opportunity to lean into some of the existing pieces that maybe are in, another side of the business that you might be able to lean on instead of creating something that's net new. So that's just a little bit of background on kind of where we got this topic from and kind of where we want to dive in on this.
Yeah, absolutely. And really to, I think, help illustrate a lot of where we're headed with this, I think, John, you've got a diagram, a little bit of, so to help, I think, set the stage or some background as to what we mean by security. For those that may not be familiar at all with IT security and really some of the methodologies that they follow in that piece of the world for IT, there's a really popular framework called the NIST framework. And this is if you're looking at IT security, you're looking at the different governance mechanisms or the different activities that you should invest in from a IT security perspective. This is how they break those down, all the way from getting visibility into that portfolio, all the way through sort of post recovery or post activities, potentially after breach, making sure that she can recover appropriately. And for those that may be familiar or not with cloud financial management, it almost is the exact same flow, right? Even up front, when you heard me talk about the identify stage, I mentioned visibility. And that's like the first thing that we champion inside of AWS from a cloud financial management perspective is you've got to get visibility in your spend. I had a former manager tell me that when I was in security, he said, you can't protect what you didn't know that you had. And that's the same thing with cost. You can't help to manage the cost if you didn't know that that was an asset or what that asset was there for.
Yeah, and I think one of the other areas that we've seen come up with a few customers recently is they're talking about tagging best practices. They're starting to look at things from, cost allocation tagging perspective, but there may already be some sort of, tagging taxonomy that's being used, in another part of the business, and maybe there's an opportunity to piggyback on top of that and either use some of the controls that are enforcing those other tags, or at least be aware of another tagging taxonomy so that they can be complementary and not be
Mm-hmm.
opposing from that side. But I put something over here in the chat around this NIST framework. If you're interested in hearing more about this, there was a great reInvent talk and a great presentation at one of the public sector summits that goes into a bit more detail on it. And there are a few pieces, that they mentioned kind of leading into it that I think are relevant for this conversation, where they talk about how the NIST framework is really designed to help kind of create a common language so that if you're talking to business leaders about why this is important, you can approach them about that. And you're not just immediately jumping down into, those technical operational details. It's going to give you some basis for approaching, different business owners and talking to them about how to identify the workloads. How do you balance, continuous monitoring with, some of the controls that could sit in place to help with, preventative measures and pieces like that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and when you were talking about tagging, it also reminds me, from a security perspective, you probably also within your organization have some type of IT asset inventory, whether that is an change database, CMDB,
CMDB, yeah.
yep, or maybe it's an app catalog. So somewhere you're probably tracking these assets, and you're probably doing that for a security purpose. It's those types of repositories that you can leverage in your tagging experience, because from cost, you want to know, okay, well, what cost center does this relate to? Who's the owner of this thing? What is it here for? Is it production? Is it non-production? Or what application? All of that information is probably already there in your catalog, your CMDB, or your asset inventory. And if you're already doing that from a security compliance perspective, just take that ID or take that one unique identifier, and that's what you can tag in your cloud experiences, so that you don't have to come up with 5 different tags. Just tag that one thing, and then you can always link that back for more metadata about your assets within the cloud.
Yeah, and you mentioned another piece in there too, Bryce, around differentiating between those production and non-production environments. And I think that's another area of overlap where maybe we're going to have different controls from a security perspective for prod and non-prod, just like we're going to have the same like kind of set of different goals and targets for not prod and non-prod from a cost governance standpoint too, right?
Totally. And one of the things that I try to help my customers a lot with is, there will be options around savings plans and reserved instances that you can help commit to help reduce costs. But once you've gone through that, then the question comes, well, what other areas are there to identify savings opportunities or to drive efficiencies on a per price perspective? And one of the examples that we have, for example, in EC2 is to leverage Spot. And customers will say, well, gee whiz, I'm not really comfortable leveraging Spot in my production environments because we're just not architected to be able to do that. And I say, hey, just because you can't use it in your production instances doesn't mean you can't use it in your lab environments. Doesn't mean that you can't use it in non-production. And it's really to start opening that door for the customer to realize it's not a bimodal view that you do it all for Spot or you don't do it all for Spot. There are happy mediums where you can do both. And that is, again, one of those overlaps with IT security. you wouldn't apply the same policy writ large across all of your environments, right? You have varying levels or stages of security depending on what you're trying to secure. Same thing here with cost. You have different varying levels of expectations you can set through your portfolio.
Hmm. And as you're talking through this, Bryce, I'm looking over here at our chart that we have up on the screen, and thinking about maybe just one other area, and that's, in this identify pillar, we talk about identifying resources right now, stuff like the CMDB. We also have this area around, identifying like opportunities that we might have.
Mm-hmm.
And that's different than, how we're necessarily going to remediate those. And I think that's something else that we've seen where folks in the FinOps world might be looking at tooling that's available for them. And, when we're first getting started, we're focused on identifying opportunities. But we've got to also think about how we're going to go through and remediate those. And those could be different
Mm-hmm.
tooling sets. And I think maybe that's just something else to think about as we're navigating like the tooling landscape in this world. We've got tools that are going to help us identify opportunities. Then we're going to have the tools that are going to help us actually remediate or, provide kind of continuous preventative measures to prevent us from getting into a situation where we're doing
Mm-hmm.
something from a cost perspective that we weren't intending or we weren't expecting.
Yeah, and I know certainly in the second half of this chat, we're going to be talking about shifting left of that software development lifecycle and how you can start preventing costs. But one of the segue topics that we have getting into this is, in security, you talk a lot about prevention. You talk a lot about how can we just by default natively deliver a secure solution. It's the same thing with cost. So there was a book that I read that was pretty transformative for me, and it was called Nudge by Richard Taylor, and he's a behavioral economist, and he won the Nobel Peace Prize for basically the study of why do people make the decisions that they do that are sometimes completely, economically speaking, irrational. Why do they do that? And his book Nudge is a follow-on from that assessment behaviorally, and it focuses on what are those little tiny things that you can do that have drastic effects on the outcome much later down the process. And one of those is called the power of defaults. And it's the same way with cost as well as what you would do with security. In security, look at what AWS just did with S3, right? Buckets natively are going to come hardened. Buckets natively now are not going to be publicly accessible, right? That's an example of, from a security perspective, delivering by default a secure solution. With cost, it's the same principle. What are those things that you could do that by default? So for example, one of the things that you can do is by default in your organization, have an expectation that you'll deploy a smaller instance size. It's totally okay that customers or that users internally to your organization deploy larger instances. That's not a concern. The concern is that you can start them off small, then ratchet large as you need it, versus trying to start with a larger instance and constantly try to fight that battle to get it down to an appropriate level.
So if we've got standards that are, available for us, enforce those standards, give folks maybe an opportunity to opt out of those if the workload necessitates it. But, by kind of giving that like, guiding principle, they're going to be able to start with that and use that as a standard and as a default. That's kind of what you're saying, right?
Absolutely. And it could be a very small thing. So let's say that you have a service catalog, or let's say that in your organization, users can't deploy unless they're using ServiceNow or using some other deployment mechanism that's going to automate that. The small thing that you can do is by default, put the smallest options on the list first. Because human behavior is that when you're looking at a form and you're selecting the instances, if by default the answer is just a cheaper option, then you're going to see that mentality shift where you're going to see a lot of cheaper options being deployed in your environment. It's just human behavior of what we do.
That's a good point. And I'm just going to bring one of these comments up on the screen for us right now from Rob, where it says anomalies are another area of FinOps where, or maybe I'm misreading this here. Anomalies is another area where FinOps offers defense in depth that can get CISOs on board with FinOps if they're not. Do you see security and FinOps teams working well together in most organizations, or is there often tension? That's a great question. Bryce, not sure if you want to kind of hop on that one first, then I'll kind of
Yeah,
share my perspective too.
So, really thank you, Rob, for mentioning that. So, for those that may not be familiar with the security perspective of what defense in depth means, what it means is that you can't rely on a single point of failure to protect your environment. You can't say that we're just going to protect ourselves because we only control access to the IT asset through identity access permissioning. What you're also going to do is make sure that you have a firewall in place. You're going to make sure that you have other mitigating controls in your environment so that if one fails, you've got a layered defense approach. Cost is a lot of the same way. You can't just say, I'm only going to buy savings plans and RIs, and that's just how we're going to optimize. You also can't just say, oh, well, we're just going to have a really good right sizing activity in the environment, or we're only going to never allow S3 standard to be adopted, right? You can't rely on those single point of failures from a cost perspective. So I think that's one overlap maybe in the defense in depth. But as far as could there be a symbiotic relationship between the two? So in my past experience, when I was the cloud cost manager at the oil and gas company, one of the things that we focused on was when we approached teams to partner with them from a cost perspective, we didn't approach it as an efficiency play. We approached it as a governance mechanism, of which cost is one of those pillars, but so is security. And so the way we approach them is, hey, we want to help make sure that you've got the best IT asset operating as possible. Some of that is let's make sure that, for example, these IP addresses are hardened, that you're not allowing FTP transmission protocol, that you're not allowing unencrypted transmission, that you've got either a what do you call it, Bastion server in place or not. And he said, hey, by the way, while you're doing that, did you know that it's more efficient to do these other things and improve the efficiency of your application by running a different instance type, by deploying a different service? And so we're approaching it holistically about how we're addressing the health of the application, and we're checking multiple boxes along that way to do it.
You started to kind of go into something, Bryce, that I think is a good point there too, is like, in the security world, we hear a lot of, hey, we have to assume that the breach is going to happen. And what is going to be our plan to kind of mitigate that, when that point happens? And I think that might be, another area from the cost perspective where as our customers are maturing and kind of evolving their cost efficiency practices, then they're starting to plan for those. Yeah, what is the anomaly detection mechanism? What's the remediation process? Do we have that pulse check that's put in place that's going to help us go through and kind of track this list of unusual things that we need to dive in deeper and start investigating? And might just be a little bit of a different perspective on how some folks are maybe thinking about the FinOps activities today.
Mm-hmm. And in the IT security world, one of the challenges that you have is you always have to pay attention to the fact that you're never going to be secure. There's always another vulnerability. There's always another gap in security. It's going to be impossible to always maintain a 100% secure state 100% of the time. And so you have companies that say, well, if that's the case, then I'm going to invest very heavily in a very fast reaction or response time. AWS, you can do that too from a cost perspective, right? You have to assume that there are going to be people that misconfigure a batch job, that don't pay attention and set a budget, that don't do necessarily the things that from a cost perspective that you could be or should be doing. And so make sure that you've got those budgets in place. Make sure that you've got the alerts turned on for those budgets. Make sure that you've got anomaly detection turned on, and then make sure that you're also reviewing them. It doesn't help if you've set all of that stuff up, but you've never invested in thinking through, if I get that alert, what do I do with it?
Yeah, exactly. And I'm going to bring back up one of these other comments that we saw here too, because I think this is a good place for us to kind of talk about that organizational partnership that is so important in the FinOps world, whether it's partnership with app team owners, or in this case, partnership kind of with teams that are putting other governance rulings in place that are dictating how folks are consuming cloud resources. Having that link kind of between the two of those, helps to avoid situations like, kind of being brought up here on the screen right now, where maybe there's a governance decision that does come with an additional cost. And folks maybe haven't considered that because they're indexing heavily on kind of the security consideration or another governance decision. I think we've definitely seen that happen before
Mm,
where, especially from like high availability, data protection standards,
absolutely.
they want to be able to go through and do those, but there is a cost consideration to adding that, kind of extra level of coverage. And having that organizational partnership between the two of those helps to evaluate those things upfront early and prevent that from being a surprise down the road. um, Rob had in one of the questions earlier, questioned about, do we see FinOps teams working alongside security. I just wanted to share maybe one example that we have seen there, and we see some customers that have governance tooling put in place where they could take advantage of that as a way to kind of enforce some of these other standards. And when these teams are able to work more closely together, they can usually accomplish more. They can lean on each other's practices that are already in place, and then take another team's goals and kind of couple them together to just overall use the cloud more efficiently. And I think we're even seeing that now with some customers where their cloud operations, cloud strategy, cloud governance team is absorbing FinOps goals as a part of that, or the lines
Absolutely.
becoming maybe a little bit blurrier kind of between like, hey, what's FinOps, what's governance, where does that fall? What's kind of your take on that, Bryce? What are you seeing out there in the world now?
So, man, a lot to unpack because there's lots of thoughts that were running through my mind. What people don't know is, kind of off air. John and I get caught up regularly, and the challenge that John and I have is that as we talk, there's so much that comes to mind that what should have been a 30-minute call ended up being an hour and a half because we just can't help it. And so you're probably seeing that play out live in this call. So, when we talk about, are there areas where security and sort of the cost people partner together for a common good? One example that we see a lot is security wants to do something, but either one, they can't price out, literally can't price out the cost. So you're literally helping them just kind of understand the cost implications of that decision. The other thing is, because you can see the dollars, you can attach value to certain activities that are occurring in the environment. So let's say security says, hey, we really need to make sure that we log, and we have to make sure that we log these events over in CloudTrail to achieve certain visibility of what's going on, either in retroactively understanding what's going on in the environment, or retroactively being able to associate ownership for a particular security event that we identify in Splunk or so forth. As the cost person, you can help them navigate those waters to understand the full cost implications, but then say, okay, but because you were able to do that, here's the cost associated with the activity, but here's the value in terms of you reduced response time. Yeah, you reduced the other three services that you had to leverage in order to get that same layer of visibility. So as the cost person, you can start to put numbers to different efficiencies that were gained through that experience that security team had. Another area that we see, you know, there was a different topic that, and it reminded me when we started talking about CloudTrail, is historically on-prem, there were probably a lot of things that security teams wanted to do, right? They wanted to have disaster recovery, millisecond response opportunities, full backups across the board, but they just couldn't do it because there just wasn't that opportunity. You didn't have, literally, quite literally, you didn't have that IT asset capability. You get into the cloud, you can have all of that, right? You can instantly, with a click of a button, have any capability that you want. If you wanted a Fortune 1 company type of IT capability, it's there in AWS. So instantly, security teams get really excited. They go out and they start clicking all the things. And as the cost person, while you may not have been a stakeholder in that decision, as you start your efficiency journeys, you can help put dollars to certain decision points. So some of the things that we work with our customers on is, let's say that they have a very high CloudWatch bill. We can help go in and say, hey, what is this related to? And they'll say, oh, well, we wanted ability to log everything in CloudTrail, and we wanted full metrics within 1 second reporting. And so we say, okay, that decision point is costing X amount of dollars. What is the opportunity cost if, let's say, that there was a breach or there was a disaster and you had to, instead of recovering in 2 seconds, what if that recovery period was a day? What would be the business impact associated to that particular thing? So, well, it would cost me, to throw out a number, let's say that would cost me 50,000 in missed sales for that day. Say, okay, well, the cost of keeping that and maintaining that is, let's say, $10,000 over the month. But what is the associated percentage risk that that event would occur? And now you're adjusting or you can apply a number and adjust that risk accordingly for that cost that you're associating every month to maintain something that may not occur within a year or 2 year span.
It's kind of like that world of, we've got this sort of spectrum of risk tolerance. I can save cost immediately, but maybe that's increasing, potential exposure to something that's happening down the road or compromising an SLA. Where do we find that sweet spot of cost efficiency, but also meeting, requirements that we have for the business in that area? I think all that stuff goes back to, hey, we want to make sure that everything is aligned back to the business. There's the organizational partnership where everyone is talking, everyone's goals are kind of aligned. And then the people that are, really great at, deciding what level of spend they're comfortable with are working really closely with the folks who are, focused on that business objective that they're trying to address with whatever that design decision might be.
Mm-hmm.
And I wanted to, I know we did move quickly through this, Bryce. The other piece that we were talking a little bit about too, that I think was really interesting was around, blameless culture. And this is something that came up when we had Capital One on the show, a couple months back. And I think it's a really cool piece, especially when we start talking about security, incident response, doing RCAs, how we handle that in the security world. Are there lessons from that we can take over to the cost world? And curious on your perspective there. And just while you're kind of responding to that one, I'm going to put a link into the chat here of something that we saw that was kind of an interesting blog on this and blameless culture. Just wanted to kind of share that with folks, but kind of look for your thoughts on that one, Bryce, and what you're thinking.
Well, I'm thinking we're probably gonna have a part 2 to this whole discussion. In true John Massey, Bryce Dickens fashion, we're gonna run out of time here because we haven't even talked about shift left. We haven't talked about.
We didn't get there. We missed that one. Yeah. We'll catch that on the next one.
The reason why blameless culture is so critical here is we have to understand that historically speaking, cloud is a relatively brand new development. If you go to IT wasn't something that's been around since the 70s as an official sort of practice with high performance computing being established, and so relatively speaking, cloud is brand new. Everyone is still learning. It does just because there's a spike in spend doesn't mean there was a malicious intent, and it also doesn't mean the person didn't know what they were doing. There's plenty of very intelligent, smart people that are data scientists and research analysts and so forth doing very real value add activities inside of the cloud. And so when we see these spikes in spend, we have to approach them from the standpoint of understanding, trying to see what happens so that you can prevent that in the future. Because if we've learned anything from security, if you go in attack mode, and if that person feels like they're being attacked or they're being put as the fall person for that particular incident, then you completely lose their cooperation. You lose the innovation that's going to come from other people that want to also take part because they're going to see how the other person was treated and they don't want any part of that.
Yeah, it puts folks in the defense mode versus, I think the nice part about the blameless culture is, you're not blaming the person, you're blaming the process. You're digging into why did this happen? How do we solve this next time? And I think that maybe that's not a topic that comes up very often, in the FinOps world. We do still hear a lot of folks talking about things like, the wall of shame or kind of capturing someone in that context of like top offenders lists. And, I guess maybe just curious if looking more at that blameless culture side of things and identifying the process changes that could happen would help to get through some of the sticking points that folks might be running into now. So,
yeah, absolutely. Unfortunately, man, I think we're running out of time.
I think that's it. That's a wrap for today, and maybe maybe we'll have a chance to kind of come back and revisit some of these topics. But we shared a couple of links, and just want to say to everyone, yeah, like and subscribe on YouTube, and continue to follow the channel. And we'll see everyone next week.
Yeah. Thank y'all. Y'all keep safe.